Welcome. I think we are live now. My name is Dusty Bates with Straight Talk Commercial Real Estate Academy. And with eXp Commercial, I'm here with Matt Winefield with Winefield and Associates. Today, we're going to talk about how to help protect both sellers and buyers, whether you're a broker or a seller or buyer yourself, with contaminated properties. Matt, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be here. This is my first YouTube ever.
Your first YouTube ever. Well, today, so what I'd first like to talk about, what do you guys do for remediation and contaminated properties? How do you help people who own properties or who broker properties?
We'll actually buy those properties, and very few people do. I'm a former environmental engineer. I used to be an environmental consultant. Prior to that, I worked for some oil companies, including Chevron. And so I've been remediating properties for about 35 years. And the past 12 years, I've been buying them. And we really are experts at buying properties that are in the 2 million clean value to 12 million clean value range, which is a pretty big range, actually. Because those properties, when there's contaminated soil and groundwater, almost always run into problems when they go out to market.
When you say clean value, that means after remediation work is done, what it would be worth when it's totally, clean.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, and if I start rambling with a bunch of acronyms, please stop me at any time. So clean value, that can mean the value just in the appraised value of the property, which typically doesn't include any environmental impairment consideration, would be probably the best definition.
So we're talking about contaminated properties. Like I've dealt with, gas station properties. I've dealt with properties with laundromats and stuff like that. Like what contamination do we see when we're, dealing with stuff that you could actually help with?
Well, the most common are the types of contaminated properties are the ones you've just cited. So think of that juicy corner at Main and First that has this half-acre gas station. Everyone wants to develop on it, but it's had underground tanks and underground lines that have been leaking for 20, 30, 60 years. And then also think of that strip mall in a fantastic, 70,000 vehicle per day intersection. And but it's had a dry cleaner that's been releasing solvents to soil and groundwater in small tanks, but it's been happening forever. Or for that same dry cleaner, maybe the owners dumped PCE solvents into the alley because no one really stopped those processes 50 years ago. And here in here in California, it at one time had some of the largest volume of military manufacturing in the world. So there's old warehouses and machine shops that supported war efforts and military efforts. So think of a warehouse that is no longer in operation, or a plating shop, or manufacturing of any type. You'd be surprised what kind of commercial industrial facilities may have had releases to the subsurface.
Well, so those are the kind of the more common types of things. I've had similar situations where we've got a property right now that I'm dealing with, for example, that there is an auto shop on top of the property adjacent to a KFC, and it's the exact same size, and it's in a good location that could be a good spot for a fast food location, right?
Yes.
What are the things that we need to look out for when we're exploring whether or not that's feasible?
That's a great question, and it usually starts with an analysis called a phase 1 environmental site assessment. I'm going to guess 90% of your viewers who are involved in commercial properties of any type have heard of a phase 1. So a phase 1 environmental site assessment is usually the first thing you do when you're under contract, one of the first things you do, to see if there's an environmental challenge that's been documented in the past. So that auto shop may have had some recorded releases. It may have some underground tanks that have been pulled in the past. It may have been a dry cleaner in the past. It may have been, going back 50 years, a small industrial facility? You don't really know. So the phase one is a paperwork exercise to look at regulatory and hazardous materials use on a certain property. And the vast majority of folks just read the 3-page executive summary that gets to the point of whether there's a recognized environmental condition or not. And that could be a documented release, having stored certain hazardous substances. Certain operations have had releases 80-90% of the time, so that becomes a recognized environmental condition just because they used to have certain operations. Dry cleaner would be one of those kinds of facilities. Plating shop would be another. So the first thing they do is do an phase one environmental site assessment and see if they need to drill thereafter.
So I've done the phase ones, and they say, here's historically what's happened. Maybe there's something next door. Maybe there's a gas station next door. If they had something, it could have seeped over, I suppose, to our property. And then they'll say, we don't recommend a phase two, or we do. And so when would we want to explore a phase two for this example? Hey, we're going to put an actual fast food property on site.
If you have definite development goals that such as the example you've cited, you need to do a phase two. And you will almost certainly need some sort of agency interaction to help you with your financing. Having said that, for that same example, let's say it's a very profitable center and you're going to keep the tenants and just do some tenant improvements, and there's no active agency file. Just because it might have had a certain type of facility, you don't necessarily need to drill. And we've bought sites where other people have seen recognized environmental condition. We said, yeah, but it's making money. We'll just buy it as is and make our tenant improvements and get an insurance policy that will cover us. But those insurance policies won't work for environmental matters if you've got an active agency oversight or you do a voluntary cleanup. So if you start drilling and getting data, you can't, and the data is bad, you can't insure a burning building. So just some nuances we run into when we hit that fork in the road that says drill or don't drill. It can vary significantly. Having said that, though, there are a lot of contaminated sites in just California alone. So trivia question, Dusty, how many contaminated sites do you think are in our fair state?
I have no idea.
Go to the next slide.
Let's go to the next slide. Let's see what.
So there are most scholars in the environmental community think that there are about 200,000 contaminated sites that need to be addressed. That's a big market. And so I put these two databases on here where if you're just looking at a site and you want to see if there's an active agency file, if you go on EnviroStore or GeoTracker, and there's some activity, there's a good chance it'll be on there, but be warned, not all contaminated properties with an active agency file are on these databases. It's just one of the screening tools. So this is something you can do on your own without spending $3,500 on a phase one, just to see if there's a very active, well-known contaminated site there.
So just to be clear, so we have phase ones where they're going to go back historically and look at, hey, could there have been something on site that might warrant a phase two, which Correct. Then we will perhaps open one of these things where we're going to actually have an active site that has contaminated. Right. These are actually active.
Right.
We have something in place that says, hey, these are contaminated actively. We know that.
Well, right? The 200,000 number is active and inactive and projected. So someone has looked at how many active sites there are and said, this is X percentage. And if you extrapolate it out, we think there's 200,000 in the state. And nationwide, the number people cite many times is about 4 million. So, or 2 to 4 million, that's a pretty big range. So, but these GeoTracker and EnviroStore sites are those where there's active sites, active environmental oversight by an agency, such as a regional water quality control board that works under the State Water Resource Control Board, uses GeoTracker. The Department of Toxic Substances Control uses EnviroStore. You can literally Google EnviroStore and then go in there and punch in an address. And if there is an active site, well, there's some immediate free information you can get about that. And a lot of people don't know about these very available tools.
Is it, because we're in California, is it more strict with, what's a contaminated site in California as opposed to outside of California?
Yes, it's much stricter in California than just about every other state. New Jersey is almost on par with Californian stringency. And not only is California very strict about the cleanup limits, it's also strict about who's liable. In many states, if you do a phase 1 environmental site assessment and you're buying a site and you're not the polluter, you don't necessarily have a requirement to clean it up if you want to use the site. You might be impeded from getting financing, but if you're not the polluter, you're not going to be made to clean up. Here in California, one of the big differences is if I buy that strip mall with a leaking dry cleaner, it's a very technical term, LMHB, last man holding the bag. You are probably going to be pinned with the problem, and it's up to you, the current property owner, look at previous property owners to see if you might vote. So California is very, very strict. Their cleanup standards are very hard to meet. And even as someone who's been a practicing engineer for 35 years, I sometimes look at these limits, and I'll look at the site, and I'll look at the soil, and I'll look at the groundwater issue and say, this can't be cleaned up to standards. Pass.
So as a buyer, so that kind of goes counter to what I thought of for California is, as a buyer, like you, buyer beware on commercial.
Yes.
If you buy it and it happens to be contaminated, you have to figure it out.
Yes.
It's not the seller.
Well, unless you reach some sort of agreement that the seller is going to have to do it. So, but in the eyes of California regulators, everyone on a chain of title has responsibility. In other states, it's people who are on chain of title who contribute to the contamination. So it's more strict for buyers. Having said that, though, many times what I do, and what's unique to Winefield and Associates, is we'll buy a site and we'll take on all the liability. Say, seller, you may have contaminated it, but we're walking in with eyes wide open. We have an environmental plan. We will indemnify you. When we buy the site, we'll write a letter, for example, to the regulator and say, we're responsible. And regulators, even in California, will honor that.
Great. Fantastic. So when I own a property, like we talked about gas stations and laundromats and stuff, like when would it be appropriate to get a phase 1 for a commercial asset when I'm looking at buying it or selling it?
Just about every commercial property should have a phase 1 because
Right.
there are some regulatory protections for the buyer to get it. And then you'll learn a lot. You'll learn where you might want to do your drilling because there used to be a tank. You'll learn that if you've got a couple parcels, maybe one parcel has a problem, maybe the other didn't have an environmental matter. And then because it looks at Sanborn maps, which are the old insurance maps that outline how buildings looked in the past. It looks at hazardous waste storage inventories. It's just all sorts of good information. I think it's exciting. Most people don't. That can guide you on development plans, on environmental plans. So whenever you buy a commercial property, you should get a phase 1 environmental site assessment.
And then, so like a phase 2,
time to do it. Go ahead. Sorry.
Like a phase 2, though, we would only do that if they recommend it, or would there be some other reasons?
That's sort of where the secret sauce is. And let me give you the seller's perspective. If the seller doesn't have an open file with the regulators, he sure doesn't want to open one. So when I'm selling a site that may have environmental risk or advising people on that, I say, okay, buyer can do the phase two, but the buyer only has two options. First of all, that's your data. You go through your attorney and you work through attorney-client privilege, and that's your data, Mr. Buyer. I, as a seller, don't want to see your data. And you have two paths you can take, Mr. Buyer. You can either continue with the deal after you do your phase two or drop out of the deal. I am not going to look at your environmental data and put myself at risk. So that's one way of approaching whether a phase two is done. Now, a buyer may want to do a phase two, or he may say to himself, I feel this is the kind of facility that is low risk based on the phase one. It's only been around 20 years. Let's say it's a gas station. The tanks have never had a release. Even though consultant ABC wants me to do a phase two, I think it's low risk, so I'm going to proceed and I'm going to get an insurance policy. So there are some nuances as to whether you want to do a phase two. The answer isn't always yes, because my consultant told me to. And the answer is not necessarily yes, because a regulator told you to either. Our firm will, I'm going to use the term gladly, litigate if we think an agency official is asking for too much. And we think we've got the wherewithal, the knowledge to dictate when an agency official is asking to do too much.
See.
So it's weird nuances of buying contaminated sites every day.
What does that cost to remediate? I mean, there's different levels, I imagine, right?
Well, let's go 3 slides ahead, and we'll look at some standard. Well, let's go 2 slides ahead first. And so the first thing you've got to do, so slide 4, is you've got to map out where the contaminants are. So
trying to go ahead, we got a delay. There we go. Okay, so here's one ahead there.
And then let's go to, so this is how I mapped out a site I bought in Hollywood. You see the red dotted line is the property. It was about 1/3 of an acre, old gas station. You can see some of the tanks that were there, and you see that sort of ovular set of lines going towards St. Andrew's Place. And by the way, that's just north of the 101 freeway. So what we've done here is we've drilled all sorts of holes in the ground and put in groundwater wells and sampled and did these contour maps of the contaminants. So in answer to your question, how much does it cost? It depends. But if you're doing just a first round of some borings and a couple wells, say 5 borings and 3 wells and some vapor sampling points, that's probably a $20,000 exercise. But if you've got a big problem, whether it be a strip mall, a gas station, a warehouse, it can vary substantially for these smaller sites. And so we've spent for assessments anywhere from $20,000 to $2 million. So it's a wide range. Now, $2 million is the high, and that didn't even include remediation for one site. So let's just say realistically, it's in the $20,000 to $200,000 range. And then remediation, which is actually extracting these contaminants out of the ground, treating the extracted contaminants after you've found them. That can be deep into 6 figures and into 7 figures. For a gas station remediation, typical cost is about $800,000. A dry cleaner, it's probably $1.5 million. So and that includes assess and remediation. If we go to the next slide, you can see one type of system, and this is called vapor extraction with air sparging. And what you see is that we're injecting air into the wells, and it's helping liberate some of the organic contaminants. And we're extracting through a soil vapor extraction well the contaminants as they volatilize, and then we treat it and we discharge through incineration. All that is very expensive.
Yeah, looks. I mean, I imagine like trying to go like underneath a retail strip center and fix the dirt underneath. This that was my question, is like, how do you even do that? And so you've got these, this is one of those systems.
This is the most common. And sometimes if you've got room, say it's I'm looking at buying an abandoned warehouse in the valley, and we saw pockets of PCE and TCE in the building and the former chemical storage area. And we just said, okay, that area we're going to excavate because it's just really, really high concentrations. Excavation is the most expensive way to go. But because other areas were relatively clean, we said we're going to put vapor extraction wells, such as you see here, and then we're going to excavate and dispose the very, very contaminated areas. And that process is going to take about $2 million over the course of about 5 years.
It seems to me like a lot of places might not, like, does it make sense to remediate? Like if I'm going to list a property for sale, I know my phase 1 or my phase 2 says now, hey, we've got a problem. What should I do? Should I remediate? Should I call someone like you? Like, what would be the best route for me?
Well, it all depends on who you may be. If you're someone who likes a challenge, I have someone who wanted to sell their site, and I told him what it was going to take, like I just told you. And he's 75 years old. He's a retired engineer. He said, that sounds great. This sounds fun. I'm going to do it. It's the first time in 30 plus years someone said that. Most people are like, we want nothing to do with it. So it's probably best to sell it to someone who knows what they're doing, someone who buys brownfields all the time or buys the types of facility you're selling and understands what kind of consultants to get to deal with it. And then make sure that you as a seller gets appropriately indemnified, and make sure that indemnification is worth more than just the paper it's written on. And there are nuances, legal nuances we don't have time to get into to ensure that indemnification is strong, but it's very important and you need a lawyer for that. And so, and also if you are someone who thinks you'll be giving, that if you don't sell, you'll be giving the property to your heirs, well, you might want to think of that, what happens thereafter. Once someone passes, their heirs get it, and their heirs also get the liability, especially if the site was owned in someone's name. If it was owned, say, in a trust or in someone's family name, that's higher risk to the heirs personally than if it was just an LLC. If it's just an LLC, the responsibility rests in that LLC, and it's hard to pierce it. So there are all sorts of reasons why you may or may not want to sell as is. If you want a challenge and you want to spend a few years and several $100,000 getting the process going, the site will be more valuable if, for instance, you've assessed it and you've got an approved remediation work plan and you're on the path to closure. So that's going to reduce your hit on the sales price. But if you've got, let's just put together an example, and we keep on using it, but so let's continue. Strip mall, say it's worth $8 million clean. The consultants agree that it's a $2.5 million cleanup process. Well, if you want to spend $2.5 million, go for it and spend 5 to 7 years. Having said that, though, if you sell now, first of all, that $2.5 million is anybody's best professional guess at the onset.
Yeah.
And then I, as the buyer, won't agree to just a $2.5 million reduction because I know I'm going to have to pay that out sometime. And it's higher risk. It's no longer a 5 cap transaction. It's the cap rate has to be bigger, and I need to get a reduction for the direct costs I'm going to have. So it's a good question. There's a lot to be thought of, and things change whether a regulator is looking over your shoulder or not. That makes a big difference.
Well, we talk about like the time value of a dollar, right? So it may cost, like, so, you know, I do multifamily too. So we talk about like, hey, you open up a Victorian 1918 building's walls, you're getting into a big question mark, right? So this is
Good
kind
analogy.
of the same. You've got to you know you have a problem behind the walls. When we open up those walls, that may grow exponentially. There could be a lot more problems than we know about. And so you can do that yourself, Mr. Seller, and fix whatever it is. Hey, maybe we need, and then we find out we have to replace all the plumbing and the electrical's all shot to hell. Or you can just hire, have someone sell it to someone at a discount, knowing there's a problem, and let them handle it. And so that's what you're saying is you guys specialize in this, and you could sell it to someone like you, and they'll handle it, and you'll also hold them harmless after the sale, which is fantastic too.
Correct. That's what we do, and thank you.
All right, so you guys, let me see if am I missing any other questions? I was looking down our list here of things we wanted to talk about. Is there anything else I'm missing that you would like to cover right now for this?
Well, I think I would say that these kinds of transactions are not for the faint of heart, and these are challenging problems. They almost always cost more than people think at the beginning, and but then again, if you're going to hire an expert, you're going to pay for their expertise with the reduction in the sales price. Now, there's a difference also in selling a site that's worth, say, 12 million clean or less versus a $100 million transaction. I was just approached yesterday, as a matter of fact, to look at a site in Southgate that has a clean value of 44 million. But the remediation challenge is just $2 million. That's a much different exercise than a $10 million site with a $2 million problem. So what I've cited today may not apply to some of these huge transactions. Trammell Crow has the big developer will buy these big sites and has their own environmental department. So their analysis is different than someone who's got a family office and selling some of these smaller sites. So I think that's another important thing to point out. And I guess I would also say it's very, very important to pick environmental consultants who understand your kind of facility. I've looked at a lot of environmental consultants' reports that prompted a lot of unnecessary work and scary discussions with regulatory officials, including one I looked at last week, whereby a work plan was approved to do about $150,000 of assessment work. And I said, get a lawyer. You don't need to do that. So just be very careful. Know that this is a very tricky business. And I think that would be the bottom line for environmental sites.
Very good. Yeah, I'm up here in Sacramento. We've got the Sacramento rail yards. I'm not sure if you
remember. Big area, huge. And then if you go to the last slide here, there's my contact information. If people have questions, they can contact you. Or that's and I did steal that adage, "Got dirty dirt" from the Got Milk commercial. I'm sorry, I plagiarized it.
Well, great. Okay, so Matt, that's all for me on those. I think this was a good, concise discussion on this. If you have any questions, Matt's information is right there. We'll make sure it's in the information below too. If you guys have any questions, or if you're a broker, or if you're an owner that wants to get some consulting on this type of stuff, Matt's been doing this for how many years, Matt?
35.
35 years for this type of stuff. So if there is an expert, he is the guy.
Thank you.
And Matt, thanks for taking the time and helping me get more acquainted with this kind of stuff too.
Thanks for having me, Dusty. Great to see you. Be safe out there, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.